Welcome, everyone. This is our annual Kress Fellow Talk. Kress Fellows are founded by the Kress Foundation, American and Canadian students who can work in the Netherlands, based at Leiden University, on their PhD for 2 years. So that means we can ask or invite a student every year, and we have an old student still there, so they cross. So this year we have Alec Aldrich and Felicity Good. And we start with the talk of Alec. Alec is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and his advisor is Anne Jansen Adams. He's writing his dissertation on the intersection of 17th century Dutch landscape images with the visual culture of engineering. His other research interests include early modern print culture, the history of drawing, and travel culture. Alec, I'm gonna put first your PowerPoint ready. Proceed. Yes, there you go. And I got to put my, there he is.
Okay, thank you, Stein, for the introduction. And thank you also to Leiden and to the Kress Foundation for allowing me to be here today. So without further ado, I will just jump into my talk, 17th century Dutch landscape, technology, and projects, the Atlas Blaeu-van der Hem as common ground. This unique hand-colored etching pictures a series of sluices and an administrative building with grounds from two perspectives. As viewers, we are immediately asked to compare these two very different perspectives. One we can call a landscape view from a bird's eye point of view, and the other a technical or ground plan of the site. The landscape view of the site showing the three sluices and a classicizing building to its right. A banderole identifies the site as Svanenberg, also known as Halfweg, which, as the text indicates, is between Amsterdam and Haarlem. Next to the sluices is the House Svanenberg, which served as a meeting house for the Rhineland Water Board. This organization was and still is responsible for water management in much of Holland. The sluices or lock gates were a critical discharge point for water from the interior of Holland. Below the vignette, the main image shows the same site in ground plan format. Gilded letters on either side of the sluices identify Svanenberg as the junction between the Haarlemmer Meer and the Ij. You can still see the building and the lopsided hexagonal bastions, as I've pointed out in the Google Images image, if you're taking the train from Haarlem to Amsterdam, if you're sitting on the right side of the train. Now, House Svanenberg was completed in 1648, while the sluices were finished in 1654, the same year as the print's publication. As a print, the image exists in multiples, but I am intentionally discussing the unique impression on the screen because of its context. It is found in volume 15 of the Atlas Blaeu-van der Hem, which is comprised of 46 volumes painstakingly assembled by Laurens van der Hem, a member of an exceptionally wealthy family in 17th century Amsterdam. Each volume is dedicated to a particular region. Volume 15 covers the Northern Netherlands. The famous Atlas Major, which you see pictured on the right, published by Johan Blauw starting in 1662, formed the basis of van der Hem's undertaking. Blauw's atlas only ever consisted of a maximum of 12 volumes, so van der Hem clearly made significant additions to the Atlas Major. The print I have just described was added to the volume by van der Hem himself and was not part of the original atlas. It was also hand-colored and gilded at van der Hem's direction. While precise dating of the assembly of the volumes is difficult, Erland ter Groot has convincingly argued that van der Hem likely commenced assembling the material for volume 15 in 1664 and finished in 1672. Of immediate concern is the act of comparison in the Svanenberg print between the two kinds of images within it. In the context of this talk, I am using that visual situation to pose a larger question about engineering images in the Atlas Blaeu-van der Hem and their relationship to landscape drawings that also populate the atlas, and what the outcome of that relationship is. I want to argue that van der Hem's atlas modeled comparative viewing of images for economic and technological data in such a way that melded aesthetic appreciation with visual apprehension of so-called practical engineering content, creating a so-called common ground, as my talk is titled. This viewing experience relates to and is indeed informed by early modern understandings of technology. I access that technological perspective through discussion of the project, a term with specific cadence in the context of early modern political economy and related scholarship that I will discuss very soon. To be clear, I am less concerned here with the history of technology as a history of innovations or turning points than I am with the viewing experience of technological images and how technology was thought and pictured at a given moment in time. I will conclude with some discussion of how this framework informs my dissertation, which explores the relationship between the landscape genre and engineering in the 17th century Dutch Republic. Ultimately, I want to suggest that the viewing experience of engineering images coincided with a particular view of land and, by extension, landscape. Oops. Positioned to the left of the first print in the same physical opening in volume 15 is another print of the Svanenberg site from the same print series of 1654 that was also added to the Atlas by van der Hem. It shows the Svanenberg sluices in numerous formats. It is divided roughly into 3 rows, even more so than the first print I showed you on the right. Recall the bird's eye view and ground plan. The second print asks the viewer to scrutinize a lot of different visual features of the sluices. In no particular order, the viewer is asked to, for instance, vertically assess the exterior and interior layers of the bastions. Those are the blue arrows, and then horizontally distinguish the constructed layers of the sluices themselves. Those are the red arrows. Those can be considered alongside exterior and interior elevations. Those are the purple arrows. The viewer is even asked to review a historical plan of the easternmost sluice with the new construction, and those are the green circles. This kind of viewing dictates the experience of other prints in volume 15. This is primarily with before and after images. Another hand-colored print added to the Atlas at van der Hem's direction includes a print before the reclamation of the Beemster polder, published by Jan Blau's father, Willem Blauw, in 1607. It is immediately followed by a map of the reclaimed polder, published some 50 years later, that demonstrates the success of the undertaking, as well as van der Hem's commitment to its documentation. Another set, also added by van der Hem, shows a similar before and after sequence, but with a slight twist. The print on the left shows the progressive encroachment of the Haarlemmermeer within the interior of Holland from the 16th century to about 1640. The print on the right shows the reclamation of the Haarlemmermeer. Unlike the Beemster, however, the Haarlemmermeer was not successfully drained until the 19th century. Although this pair suggests a before and after of a completed undertaking, it is instead an image of a proposal and desired outcome. I think it is reasonable to suggest that van der Hem not only wanted to collect visual information about the Netherlands through his collection of prints, he likely wanted to produce opportunities for comparison as well. This is true in volume 15, but I think there is wider applicability to this principle. On the screen are examples of engineering and economic activities from other volumes. At left is one of a series of hand-colored prints showing the Felicity salt mine, pardon my pronunciation, in Poland, from volume 22 of van der Hem's Atlas. From volume 8, one finds a print of the Mediterranean side of the Canal du Midi in France. This was a massive canal-building enterprise that connected the Mediterranean and Atlantic Oceans through the southeast of the country. From volume 45, I share a map of the Brazilian coast where the Dutch had set up sugar plantations on the heels of the Portuguese. In this map, one can see slaves crushing sugarcane with the aid of a watermill in the top half of the composition. Of these 3 additional hand-colored prints, only the Brazilian exemplar is original to the Atlas Maior as conceived by Jan Blauw. Van der Hem's engineering interests were therefore systematic and by no means confined to the Netherlands. His practice of collecting and collating this visual information allowed for sustained appraisal of economic and technological developments at home and abroad. The practice of intentional and even international comparison is also a feature of 17th century projecting. This is a term used frequently in the context of 17th century English political economic history, but it is helpful here in characterizing the material we have covered and the way that viewing those images is structured. Daniel Defoe's essay on projects of 1697 is something of an document in the history of projects. He refers to the time of the English Civil War at about mid-17th century as an early stage in English projectomania. For Defoe, projects ranged from the serviceable to the absurd, from windmills that draw water to devices to permit divers to walk the bottom of the Thames River. As such a range implies, projects could be both real and, shall we say, aspirational. Modern historians have ventured broad definitions of the term project. The social and economic historian Joan Thrisk has defined a project as a practical scheme for exploiting material things. As Koji Yamamoto has cogently written more recently, the aims of a project at its best were to reevaluate labor, technology, and knowledge as strategic arms of good governance that could promote the common good. And while the use of English sources in my talk about Dutch images may give pause, my own preliminary work on the Dutch side of this equation reveals some promising commonalities. In this Dutch tract of 1670, about the fresh water supply of Amsterdam and Leiden, for instance, we find a similar sentiment as the author on the title page refers to himself as a lover of the common good. Notable in 17th century texts on projects is their insistent use of juxtaposition as an organizing principle and as a form of argumentation. This practice often involved England and the Dutch Republic, and frankly, how England should be modeling itself on the Dutch. By the 1670s, one could find English writers referring to Dutch initiatives as projects, as in the case of the English diplomat William Temple, who went on a trip to the lowlands in 1668. In 1673, he published his travel memoir, Observations upon the United Provinces of the Netherlands. He notes how, quote, low interest and dearness of land are effects of the multitude of people and cause so much money to lie ready for all projects by which gain may be expected, as the cutting of canals, making bridges and causeys, leveling downs, and draining marshes, besides all new essays at foreign trade, which are proposed with any probability of advantage. In addressing the enthusiasm for projects abroad, Temple is essentially making the case for England to do something similar. Another even more explicit use of comparison in projecting is Andrew Yarrington's England's Improvement by Sea and Land to Outdo the Dutch Without Fighting, which was published a few years later in 1677. And yes, it's really called that. In his discussion of the prosperous Dutch textile industry, he includes a print or, quote, pattern of the windmill for thickening fine clothes that is taken from the Dutch at Haarlem in Holland. While he does not use the term project specifically, the print he provides nonetheless presents a visual confrontation of sorts. The image and the text alike immediately contrast the Dutch manner of constructing a fulling mill with a kind of river mill built in the Elbe at Dresden. In addition to a comparative mode of thinking, the term project suggests a type of image through its historical usage. As Yamamoto has written, the word derives from the Latin proiectum, meaning that which is thrown forth, put out, or cast out. In the 15th century Italian context, the term proiectio could connote planning in general, while the Middle English proiect connotes a design or pattern. In 16th century French, project designates a map or architectural draft. According to the Institute for de Nederlandse Taal, the term project also appears in 17th century Dutch documents. Writing at the Cape of Good Hope in 1656, Jan van Riebeek records the procurement of logs for a projected dock that will make it easier for people to load and unload goods. In the Dagregister of the Kasteel Batavia in Indonesia, in the same year, oddly enough, the author in that context notes that a surveyor has executed a project on paper based to strengthen the fortress at Batavia. This design, he notes, was based on the bulwark at Groningen. These statements are revealing. A project image in the Dutch context could be something not yet built, but imagined or derived through comparison. Oops. On the screen is a Dutch example of what a project image might look like outside the context of the Atlas Blaeu-van der Hem. In this portrait of the lawyer, engineer, and architect, Nicholas Listing, for instance, the papers dangling off his desk refer to an unrealized building on the Rembrandtplein in Amsterdam, and a design for a sea dike that also appears in a tract he wrote on the subject. Such images could reasonably be called projects. Similar to what we find in the projecting literature, van der Hem's atlas comprises comparative prints of projects from the Netherlands as well as the rest of Europe and its colonized lands. Some of these are realized projects, including the Svanenburg sluices and the Beemster polder, but others, such as the reclamation of the Haarlemmermeer, are projects as in something designed but not yet achieved. Because the Atlas Blaeu-van der Hem also includes numerous landscape drawings that he either collected or commissioned for his atlas, we must ask what the relationship is between the engineering images, projects, and landscape images by artists. In the Netherlands volume alone, one finds landscape drawings by well-known Dutch artists such as Lambert Domer and Simon de Vlieger, as well as less famous individuals including Jacob van der Kroes and Esaias van Hulsen. Landscape and engineering coexist by virtue of their intentional placement together in van der Hem's atlas. And here I'll just point out the numbers refer to the sequence in the volume, but I'll also describe the sequence. Of the images we have looked at in the Netherlands volume of the atlas, Domer's drawing comes first. Then the two prints of the Haarlemmermeer, immediately followed by two prints of the Svanenburg sluices. Third is the de Vlieger drawing on blue paper, followed shortly after by a pair of drawings depicting the sea dike at Patten. Then we see the Beemster prints. Lastly, the Van der Kroes drawing pictures the resonant ruins of the Castle Emond, a favorite subject of many Dutch landscape artists. Landscape and engineering, in other words, flow into each other in an open-ended dialogue. We have discussed the importance of comparison to looking at engineering images in the atlas, and it is important to recall that landscape drawings themselves similarly invite comparative viewing, merely as a standard practice of aesthetic appreciation. One could assess, for instance, the pursuit of tonal richness through differing means in the Domer and de Vlieger drawings. For Domer, through the application of washes, and for de Vlieger, through the manipulation of blue paper as a middle tone. And this is just an example. The pair of drawings of the sea dike at Patten is somewhat more complex. Divided into two registers, the top drawing is an unusual case, as it was executed in 1614 by Esaias van Hulsen. It is signed and dated. A native of Middelburg, most known for his intricate ornament prints. Whether or not this attribution holds, we can get into that. The drawing in the lower register is not signed, and I suspect it is from another hand, where the top image demonstrates a sensitive modulation in the density and tone of line to convey spatial recession. The bottom drawing is actually highly uniform in its use of dark, thick strokes of brown ink. This last case is an intriguing visual situation in which one is asked to examine the distinctive visual treatment of the subject, as well as the characteristics of the engineered site itself. Artistic, engineering, and projecting mindsets converge. In some, there are certain kinds of landscape drawings by artists that benefit from consideration of how engineering and projecting inform their appreciation. On the one hand, a pair of landscape drawings gain engineering value within the context of an atlas filled with early modern projects. By the same token, there's little question in my mind that the engineering prints gain merit as aesthetic objects through their minute coloring and gold additions. It is certainly the case that the engineers responsible for the Svanenburg project were held in high esteem and merited such treatment of their design. The sluice print likewise includes information indicating the role of Klaas Cornelissen van Assendelft in the renewal of the sluices in between 1652 to 1654. The inscription refers to his grandfather, Klaas Hendriksen van Assendelft, as a noteworthy and skillful master. The publication of this print in itself celebrates that fact, but the painstaking addition of color transforms van Assendelft's work into an aesthetic object. In other words, it elevates the inventor of the project as much as the project itself. This valorization of the engineering content and the responsible engineers is made all the more evident when we were confronted with the Svanenberg print series as a whole. Two architectural elevations of the meeting house itself, designed by leading architect Peter Post, those are the uncolored prints in the right column, they were not included in van der Hem's atlas. In other words, buildings by a leading architect were not given the same pride of place as a set of sluices. For this reason, too, I think that landscape drawings by artists need to be evaluated very carefully in this context to understand how they possessed value. The engineering and landscape images I have discussed in this talk share certain commonalities. First, they are found together in the Atlas Blaeu-van der Hem. Second, they demand comparative viewing that is connected to the conceptual nature of early modern projects. Third, engineering and landscape images ultimately share aesthetic and informational content that is not disconnected from the high regard that engineering images and engineers possessed. It is this shared space of the aesthetic and practical components in landscape that I pursue in my dissertation, Common Ground, Landscape and the Mediation of Technology in the Dutch Republic. In my dissertation, I want to suggest that the phenomenon I have described in the Atlas Blaeu-van der Hem actually saturates certain sectors of the Dutch landscape tradition. To take the example of the watermill, I share two drawings by Frédéric de Moucheron at Vienne, which is a town outside of Lyon in France. Both drawings appear in volume 4 of the Atlas. One could inspect these two drawings not just as examples of an artist's graphic oeuvre or scenic locales, but also as images of two distinct types of watermills suited to their particular environments. This last information is not incidental to aesthetic appreciation, but actually significant content in its own right, given the emphasis placed on engineering in the Atlas as a whole. I want to suggest that, outside of the immediate context of the Atlas, a similar mindset could pervade the work of Dutch landscape artists such as Jacob van Roosdael. At top right is a drawing of a watermill at Deventer, one of the many drawings of watermills he made in the vicinity of the border between modern-day Netherlands and Germany. In addition to their scenic attributes, they likewise collect engineering information from a particular region of the world. If comparison is the basis of aesthetic and practical assessment, these landscape images could demand deeper levels and more manifold forms of discernment than has perhaps previously been acknowledged. When we consider his watermill paintings, such as the example from Los Angeles at the right, and which lacks a definitive geographic identification, it is worth keeping in mind his artistic prerogative in essentially inventing scenes based on previous experience. In these instances, a watermill painting is not so different from proposals for draining the Haarlemmer Meer, an image of an ambitious engineering project meant to inspire 17th century viewers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alec. I'm gonna prepare. Yes, that's the PowerPoint of Felicity, but let me first.
It's not the same.
No. Yes. Yeah, we were running it. So go to the first one. There we go. We're all ready for Felicity, but let me first introduce her. Before I introduce her, I want to say that all questions can be put in the chat. So please put your questions in the chat and we will deal with them after the talk of Felicity. So we're going to gather all questions at the both talks. Felicity is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Santa Barbara as well. Her advisor is Mark Meadow, and her dissertation is entitled Locating Childhood, the Visual Culture of Children in Early Modern Antwerp and Mexico City. Her research interests are the artistic exchange between Northern Europe, Spain, and colonial Latin America during the 16th century, the history of print and book production, and early modern epistemologies. Felicity, the floor is yours, and now we're gonna make a 180 turn. There we go. Yes, something that way.
Tucked away in the far lower left corner of Peter Bruegel the Elder's children's games are two adolescent girls playing with dolls. Facing each other, they sit on the ground in a doorway of a rustic building. Displayed on the shelves above the girls is a miniature altar that is seemingly dedicated to the Virgin Mary. A tiny figurine of the Virgin of the Apocalypse, wreathed in flames and standing atop a crescent moon, appears on the uppermost shelf alongside crosses, devotional woodcuts, and other religious trinkets. The lower shelf contains another doll, dressed in a black gown and matching headdress. This figurine stands next to a tiny cradle that holds an infant doll whose appearance is suggested by Bruegel's loose brushstrokes. This small vignette asks its well-educated adult viewers to consider not only the ubiquitous activity of playing with dolls, a mainstay of female childhood in the early modern period and today, but also these figures' own relationship to adulthood, the prospect of motherhood, their religious beliefs, as well as the status of images and idols, a fraught topic in 16th century Antwerp. These are only a few select examples from the constellation of possible questions and associations evoked by this quiet and contemplative scene that are indicative of the complicated intersection of play, education, and the position of children within the early modern social and civic orders. Elsewhere in children's games, myriad activities play out across a large composition. Over 200 kids participate in games like Blind Man's Bluff, which is seen in the lower right, Leapfrog in the upper left, and bowling. They play with toys, including a hobby horse and rolling hoops. Some spin tops, and other girls throw knucklebones. And in some cases, children take on the role of young parents, as in the baptismal procession outlined in the blue box, or members of a bridal party outlined in the yellow. This mixing of playful activities that imitate serious institutions of adult life, like marriage or parenthood, with the more seemingly light-hearted games, demonstrates that there likely existed a broad understanding of the nature and purpose of childhood play during the early modern period. In the second chapter of my dissertation, more broadly, I argue that acts of play, including playing with other children, playing with toys, playing games, and playing pretend or masking, functioned as methods of social education that were grounded in humanist ideas concerning how a strong moral character could be cultivated during childhood in order to better ensure that children would grow into virtuous and prosperous adults. For the purposes of this brief presentation, I will examine more closely the ways in which an image like Bruegel's children's games reveals both aspirations and anxieties surrounding the unrealized nascent potential of children, good, bad, or otherwise. Because there are so many figures, somewhere around 220 in total, and approximately 90 different games which have been painstakingly identified by scholars like Sandra Hinman, my focus here tonight will center entirely on Bruegel's children's games, and more specifically, around representations of imitative play present throughout the work. To this end, I consider ways in which both children engaging in play and games and the concept of imitation are discussed in humanist writings on education and child rearing. Not in the classical rhetorical sense of imitatio, although I do think that that probably warrants further investigation, but rather I am interested in imitation as a method of learning that occurs through the observation and embodied experience of the person undertaking it. Throughout this presentation, it remains important to consider how Bruegel challenges his 16th century audience, who again was adult, wealthy enough to afford such a painting, and likely also very well educated, to contemplate not only their own relationship to childhood and its experiences, but also the contemporaneously shifting and increasingly integral position of children within early modern society. I argue that the complex scene playing out across the composition enabled and encouraged such viewers to investigate and actively construct meaning concerning the nature and expectations of children. The relationship between behavioral education and imitative play, as well as like where children fit in the civic order. Bruegel's painting suggests that gameplay, sport, and playing with toys, for example, were activities heavily associated with childhood. Representations of imitative activities throughout the scene, in which children take on the roles and identities of their adult counterparts, are encouraged through play to imagine their own relationship to adulthood. And it raises questions concerning how play was understood as a critical component of a child's education, both in and out of the classroom. How was it understood as part of a larger process of learning that taught children through imitative and enacted experience about expectations of their futures? And in what ways were young people best prepared for entry and participation in adult life, its spaces, and its attendant customs? Children's games has been the subject of much scholarly inquiry. Early scholarship focuses on the presence of a prevailing world upside down theme or generally moralizing message, as evidenced by visual cues like the prevalence of blue cloaks, a proverbial sign of foolishness, or late medieval associations between childhood and folly. In the search for a common thread, much work has been done, as I previously mentioned, to identify games throughout the scene. Hinman, for example, draws associations between children's activities and medieval calendrical imagery or representations of the ages of man, in this case, the earliest age of infancy. And other scholars have indeed eschewed this impulse to search for overarching meaning within the work. Edward Snow, for example, focuses on spatial relationships between Bruegel's representations of specific games, like in the upper left corner, the visual proximity of the top card and skirt spinners in the middle ground, or the thematic relationship between the marital procession and games like Knucklebones and Blind Man's Bluff, both of which have associations with the inherent risks of romantic partnership or marriage. Sorry. In her recent dissertation and related articles, Amy Orrock examines the relationship between humanism, 16th century literature, education, and children's games. And she makes clear that early modern educators like Desiderius Erasmus and Juan Luis Vives were indeed interested in the usefulness of play as part of a larger educational program. And it is this connection that I would like to explore and expand upon in my own work. Acts of imitation, in the sense of copying and subsequently learning through embodied reenactment of observed behaviors, can be understood and explored through Bruegel's painting that we see in front of us. The most pronounced of which are activities predicated upon children donning the costumes and role-playing serious customs of adult life, like marriage. Bruegel positions the young girl and boy pretending to be a bride and groom as the central figures of the composition. They are quite literally like the bride is the center of the panel. The couple, who are both dressed for the occasion, particularly the girl who wears a crown in the traditional black dress, are preceded by two flower girls sprinkling petals on the ground before them, and followed by a group of 5 other cloaked children. This entire entourage is shepherded by a grown woman, one of the only adults present in the entire scene. In the lower left foreground, at the head of a baptismal procession, a child covered by a golden shroud carries what appears to be an infant who is wrapped in a blue swaddling cloth. This apparent newborn, whose features are not visible, on their way to perhaps the small altar visible through the doorway, acts within the scene as both a potential figure in and of itself and as a plaything, an object used by the children to enhance the perceived veracity of their mock procession. It is also worth mentioning the two boys who are dressed as monks, the boy whipping his top underneath the Gothic portico of the central building, and the boy standing atop a bench under an awning of the house along the street in the background. The latter is being pursued by 4 of his playmates during a game of Follow the Leader. And while neither of these games are explicitly related to religion, although associations to flagellation and mendicant activity have been argued, these figures make a clear reference to religious institutions and, for example, entry into the clergy. Another less religiously but more economically driven example of playing at adult life can be found in the foreground at the lower right corner of the composition. Here, a young girl wearing a black frock and white apron stands behind a long wooden beam that she uses as a workbench for grinding down bricks, presumably to create pigment. She measures the powder out on scales and packages it in rolled paper, playing at intersecting ideas of commerce, craftsmanship, and artistic practice, concepts that are further reinforced by the appearance of Bruegel's signature at the end of the beam. Specific toys also promote forms of imitative play. Consider an example from earlier in this talk of the 2 young girls playing with dolls underneath the miniature altar. The dolls bear a striking resemblance to the young women. Their clothing, a black dress and white apron, and the white headdress are identical to the outfit worn by the figure whose back is turned towards the viewer. Dolls that visually mirror those who play with them function as objects that can encourage children to invent scenarios in which they, through use of the object, can imagine specific roles or activities. And a similar imaginative apparatus might be at play in the central foreground, where a very young boy stands astride a hobby horse. And while there is nothing inherently adult about riding a horse, certainly many children learn to do this today and in the 16th century, this toy might encourage the young boy to imagine himself in the role of a rider, in the guise of perhaps a chivalrous knight, or conversely, a rogue bandit. These ideas surrounding imitative and imaginative play are admittedly difficult to pin down because amusement and gameplay are ubiquitous, ephemeral, and deeply personal. They represent long-standing and widely practiced customs of childhood that are prone to idiosyncratic experiences depending on who is participating in the game. So where do these ideas and children's games as an image leave us in relation to 16th century humanist theories of education and imitation? By the time Bruegel completed this painting in 1560, humanism and its core tenets surrounding childhood, parenting, and children's education were well-established ideas in Northern European cities like Antwerp. Famous humanist teachers like Erasmus and Vives extolled the benefits of play in their pedagogical writings. Time set aside for amusements greatly enhanced the power of learning, and their reasoning follows that by allowing young students to have a break in their studies, to take part in games and or physical sports, the young mind is provided with a chance to reset and thus more readily accept new knowledge. It seems that humanist teachers were, in a manner of speaking, pro-recess and anti-burnout. Much of the discourse on play found in 16th century educational treatises applies directly to school lessons themselves. Erasmus, for example, suggests that Latin schoolmasters, to make learning more enjoyable, should allow boys the chance to take breaks from their lessons to run around outside and amuse themselves, but only under the condition that they continue speaking Latin as they do so. Outside of the context of school, play, however, warrants further consideration as it relates to the socialization of children. Games and other types of playful interactions with other children and or adults are not neutral activities, but rather they represent a different form of learning that comes from both imitation and social engagement. In his influential treatise, A Rhetorical Declamatio concerning the purpose and methods of childhood education, De Pueris Instituendis, published in 1529, Erasmus writes, quote, "The nature has given small children the ability to imitate, but the urge to imitate the evil is considerably stronger than the urge to imitate the good." End quote. Later in his treatise, he continues, quote, "Small acts of goodness, habitually repeated, amount to great virtue. It is the young who most easily acquire the good, since they possess the natural flexibility which enables them to bend in any direction. Young children are not yet enslaved by bad habits and are readily inclined to imitate whatever is suggested to them." End quote. After all, as Erasmus cautions his reader, quote, "Nothing clings more tenaciously than something that is poured into empty minds." End quote. These concerns expressed in De Pueris speak to anxieties surrounding the concepts of imitation and how adeptly children absorb behavior and knowledge from the world around them through their lived experience, both key aspects of character development. Children, therefore, engaging in role-playing games that encourage them to play-act ritual practices, like marriage, for example, I would argue, can be understood as methods for teaching children generally about the institutions and then reinforcing their importance through imitative experience that is cleverly or not so cleverly disguised as play. Erasmus, in yet another treatise, De Civilitate Morum Puerilium, on good manners for boys, from 1526, proclaims that nowhere is a boy's character more readily apparent than in a game, end quote. Regarding Bruegel's children's games, how might a 16th century viewer understand or construct meaning from a wide range of activities presented throughout the work, especially as they relate to the humanist goal of cultivating within children a strong moral character? Bruegel places games with potentially serious undertones and pedagogical aims alongside children who engage in play that does not immediately speak to the same set of concerns. Children's games, as scholars like Snow and Orrock have previously argued, with its diverse and abundant subject matter, defies a unified or fixed meaning. For example, how might viewers have made sense of the more raucous activities, like running the gauntlet, which can be seen in the left side of the composition? It's the two boys who are running through the other sitting on the ground. Games like leapfrog or tug of war, barrel riding, or even games made from hoisting your playmate up by his arms and legs, which is seen at the end of the long wooden beam in the foreground, or pulling their hair, like at the right side of the composition. And what about physical activities like swimming or climbing trees? Or perhaps pastimes that speak to notions of curiosity, like the boy at the bench in the lower foreground who holds and examines a young bird, or excuse me, like the boy at the bench in the lower foreground who examines the bird he is holding, or the young girl who peers curiously into the upright barrel. Children's games reveals a multitude of characteristics of children within the composition. The range of games presented within the painting reveals concerns not only about the potential benefits of games, such as the inculcation of adult customs and rituals to children, but also asks viewers to contemplate the possible pitfalls of character development and pastimes that seemingly lack the same kind of didactic purpose, that were more outwardly rowdy, possibly more amusing, or frankly, they look more fun. I would like to conclude my presentation tonight by considering Bruegel's composition for children's games as a whole. The large outdoor space, overrun with children playing, appears to be a public square located at the outskirts of a city, probably Antwerp, that is visible in the distance. With the deep spatial recession of the street to the right of the central stone building, the viewer's eyes and the juxtaposition of the city with the pastoral landscape on the left, the viewer's eyes cannot help but be drawn at times towards the urban setting in the background. The position of the viewer, looking slightly down upon the scene from an elevated vantage point, grants the ability to view much of the playful activity at a single glance. This perspective highlights the visual proximity between the children running rampant across the majority of the fore and middle grounds of the painting, with the city in the background. This is all to say that children here, as Bruegel depicts them, exist within the view of the city, yet remain decidedly outside of its walls. Considering humanism's preoccupation with the position of children in society and their prospects for the future, especially in terms of their educations, being undertaken in service of building and sustaining a strong and prosperous civic community, how does Bruegel's image challenge adult viewers to contemplate the relationship between children and their preparation for duties of adulthood and civic life, by placing them alongside games that speak to aspirations and anxieties that come from grappling with this subject matter? Ideas like imitative play offer only one of many possible ways of looking at the representations of games and activities throughout Bruegel's painting. In a sense, children's games not only invites but encourages the viewer, both in the 16th century and today, to do a bit of imaginative thinking regarding the intersection between character development, education, and the role of children within the social and civic orders for themselves. Thank you.
Very much, both of you, Felicity and Alec, for two great lectures. It's so nice to, oh look, we could have put ourselves a bit closer together. I think it's, let's reinstall each other. Yes, there we go. No, still closer to Alec.
Oh gosh.
Closer to Alec we go. Yes, there we are.
Yes, yeah, very close. All right. So thank you very much, both of you, for two very inspiring lectures. It's so nice to know that across the ocean there's still people working on the Netherlands, the early modern Netherlands, which is really great, and with most inspiring talks and projects. So we have already some questions, and then I'm gonna take the other computer to the questions. The first question is by Marian Pantjes. Question to Alec: how would van der Hem have used the atlas? With whom might he have discussed the images? And is it more about design than execution, seeing the interest in planned projects?
Thank you for the question. It's a good one, and it's something I couldn't really develop very much in the talk. I'll try not to have like a overly winding answer to this, but basically with van der Hem, it's interesting because for a couple of reasons. Like, one, he was in some ways very central to 17th century Amsterdam in the sense that he was the grandson of Hendrik Spiegel, who was a very important poet. But on the other hand, van der Hem was also from a very wealthy Catholic family, which created kind of a different social network for him in some respects. And then also there's just the fact that from an archival standpoint, there hasn't been a lot that's been retrieved about him specifically, so much as other members of his family. And so that's sort of a mea culpa in a sense, because who he actually like very specifically knew and who he would have really shared these images with is a little bit of an open question for those reasons. However, I think, and this isn't something I'm developing in my dissertation, I think, you know, in a general sense, he would have shared this material with other so-called liefhebbers, essentially. People who had an amateur sort of interest in people who are knowledgeable about you know, art and perhaps these engineering projects as well. I've seen the term liefhebber used in the context of engineering quite consciously. And the term liefhebber is something that's also been very well developed within the context of art history, and I won't get into all of that today. Yeah, I think in a very general sense, that is sort of the community you're expecting to find for van der Hem. And then the second part of the question was execution.
Is it more about the design than execution, seeing the interest in the projects?
Yeah, it's a good question, because at least in part, people who would collect these sort of project maps of things like the Haarlemmer Meer would have been potentially investors who were interested in the project, so they would have certainly been interested in seeing the project realized. However, that case is a bit of a unique problem in that, you know, this Haarlemmer Meer project to drain it and everything got started, well, I guess got really serious in the 1640s, basically. But van der Hem, remember, is working in like the 1660s and 1670s, and clearly nothing had happened yet because all the water was still there. So I think maybe at that stage, he was perhaps more interested in the design rather than it being necessarily a reality, particularly since the print he included in the atlas was from the 1640s. So in some ways, it's kind of a document of an idea.
Another question is for Felicity, but I'm gonna put the PowerPoint back on, because the question is why it is a baptismal procession. So maybe you want to go then to the baptismal procession in order to make your point clear.
Sure. Actually, I think the short answer to this is that it doesn't necessarily have to be. This is the theme that is present in a lot of the extant scholarship on this painting. I'm going to try to find a slide that has a detail of it. Oh, there we go. But yeah, actually, I had a very funny instance where, as I was kind of writing this presentation over the past week, I had the same thought of what necessarily makes this a baptismal presentation. And I think it has to do a lot with the proximity to the marital procession that's only a little bit above it within the overall composition, and also the joint proximity to the miniature altar to the Virgin Mary in this building that also has themes of motherhood taking place in these like little toys that are set up with the cradle and the doll next to it. So I don't know that I have a very good answer for you, but I think that it's these visual associations that have led scholars to kind of consider this to be a baptismal procession. But strictly speaking, I don't think there's anything that necessarily makes that a clear given.
Thank you. Then a question for Alec. The focus on comparative viewing is particularly compelling. I'm curious if you have comments on the current maps exhibition at the Leiden World Museum, and that's also what we presented the previous week. So that's it's a good question, Margot. Thank you very much. The curation motivates comparative viewing 2, where maps from around the world are exhibited next to each other, consequently in dialogue, not imagined by the makers and not limited to the map's own borders or intentions. In this way, can curated exhibitions and projects, so the projects as used between brackets, be compared?
So that's a question of, let me just say, I haven't seen the exhibition yet, but I really want to, and I will go see it now that there's been a question about it. I think, that's comparative viewing really is the basis of curatorial practice in a lot of ways, creating those compelling juxtapositions. How that relates to projects, I think that with projects as I am using it in my dissertation, I'm really speaking to a specific historical moment that has more to do with essentially economic gain through technological implementation, and kind of understanding how you can do that in the 17th century rises from comparison, basically. So it's a little different, but I will say that, just this question of curation and comparative viewing, Van der Hem is in essence curating an atlas and creating also these opportunities for comparison as well. In that sense.
Then I have a question for Felicity.
Sure.
I'm really interested in that idea of embodied experience. I think in the image you really made it clear how that works, but then in the humanistic theory, and how far is there really talking about embodied experience and not about education via the ratio or mind?
Right. So this is an idea that I'm going to explore further in the dissertation chapter, which is in its very nascent stages, no pun intended.
Oh God.
Sorry. But yeah, I think embodied experience probably appears in some of the literature because I believe Erasmus, also in De Pueris, talks about how sometimes children learn best through like making mistakes themselves, or that this is a way in which humans are prone to learning. And certainly going further into possible themes for not only this chapter, but my previous chapter on education, there are lots of fabulistic examples that deal with embodied experience that we can look at. I'm thinking specifically right now of the fable of the owl and the birds, which might actually have a visual corollary in children's games, because there is an owl perched over top of the boy who's examining the bird on the bench. And that fable really, what it is about is a bunch of birds don't listen to the owl's warning. Some of their friends get killed. And then the birds that survive have only learned their lesson because they felt fully the experience of not heeding the advice. So I think that this kind of theming appears not only possibly in these humanist treatises, but also in other kinds of contemporaneous source material that fits into this kind of larger educational and intellectual milieu of the 16th century as it relates to children learning in various ways.
All right, thank you very much. And then I'm so happy to have the last question. Oh, there is a new question. No. I have the last question for Alec.
Okay.
So I'm really interested in that idea of a project in its early modern sense of the word. But in how far can you also talk about the fear of the idea of a secret, the idea that people wanted to keep it a secret? Is that something that contrasts with it? Because it's typically 19th century that you really had to have those engineering info as secret as possible in order to stick it to your own place. Is there any idea that you can link images to espionage to secrets?
Secrets, interesting. And what first comes to mind is, I guess, secrets that artisans have, secrets of their
Yes.
trade, for instance.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of funny because in some way, what I'm talking about are things that have been very much published and not made
So
secret.
of
And
course,
so,
sure.
one element of my dissertation is looking at patent applications and patent drawings, which is very much not a question of keeping something secret, but actually gaining exclusive rights to something, which is slightly different.
Yes.
So there is kind of an intellectual territory that's being defended, but it's also kind of public, at least in that instance.
Yeah.
But in terms of secrets, I'll have to keep digging.
Yes, of course, they're secrets. They were kept secret.
That's right. I think that's a very good remark to close. Keep on digging, every one of us. And thank you very much, all of you, for being here. Thank you very much for those both interesting talks, and hope to see you at another museum talk. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a wonderful evening or wonderful day for the people on the other side of the ocean. Bye-bye.